Jeremy Gilbert is the Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Washington Post. He's been on board there since July 2014, in August last year. He was also the digital point man before that at National Geographic. That also did some fantastic things and still is doing some great things moving into the digital space. Jeremy's also worked at the Poynter Institute and lectured in interactive storytelling at Northwestern University in Illinois. He is doing some fantastic stuff with the Post through its on-the-road journalists and also dealing with advertisers as the business model also changes. Lots to talk about. Jeremy will speak for about 20 minutes, and after which there'll be a Q&A session, which I'm sure people will be fighting over the microphone. There'll be a roving microphone around the room after Jeremy speaks. Please give a very warm welcome to Jeremy Gilbert.
So, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me in Melbourne. It's been lovely. Thank you for the weather, which maybe not today, but over the weekend was amazing. It's been interesting, though, over the last couple of days as I've gotten to know Melbourne a little bit. I've realized a lot of our challenges at the Post are very universal challenges. They're very much the challenges that I've heard here today and from other publishers around the world. And those are things like the democratization of publishing, which in many ways is an amazing and very important, especially for democracies like ours, transformation in who can tell stories. You don't need a press. You don't even really need technologists to share content, but it very markedly changes what a news company can offer. Also, there are a changing set of competitors. You have people from BuzzFeed coming. You have certainly lots of other people in that space who are both creating original content, but also very much aggregating news and information, which, as you know, is a much cheaper way of doing business than employing a lot of professional full-time journalists to do reporting. And in no way am I suggesting that I would criticize that business model, but it certainly attacks one of our greatest costs, which are our people. Of course, the rise of social media has also very much transformed the relationship that publishers have to their audience and has really competed with us, publishers, news providers, in terms of how much time our audience is willing to give us and how they're willing to interact with us. And then the very habits of those consumers are changing. I don't know if you see it in your audiences as much as we do, but what we have discovered is that not just younger audiences, but all audiences are giving up time-worn habits. Fewer and fewer people expect to start their day with the newspaper every morning or expect to spend 30 or 40 or 50 minutes with the newspaper over the course of a day. And those habits have been evolving for a very long time. At least in the States, you've seen over generations, our grandparents and great-grandparents would get multiple newspapers in a single day. I can't think of anyone, even the most well-read person, who expects a morning newspaper, an afternoon newspaper, and then to spend time with the TV at night. So those habits are very much transforming. We have much smaller interactions with our content spread throughout the course of the day. I hope you're not as hopelessly addicted to your smartphone as I am, but I very much start my day by picking up my smartphone and looking at content and then returning to that over the course of the day, even around the other things that I do, even around the media consumption, the television, the radio, the podcasts, all the others. So this space is very much different than it was even a few years ago and is changing incredibly rapidly. So like many of your organizations, the Post has some advantages. And I don't mean to suggest otherwise, even with all these challenges. So we certainly have Ben Bradley and Woodward and Bernstein and the reporting on Watergate and the Pentagon Papers and many of the things that have made people in the US and hopefully internationally trust the Post over the years. Because we will hold the government accountable, because we will report on important topics, because we will cover the things that matter to people. And certainly we've had more than 60 Pulitzer Prizes, and we even recently have had really valuable and important reporting about Edward Snowden and the NSA disclosures, about failings of the US Secret Service recently. So it's not that we have stopped doing those things, that hardcore reporting that's so important to our audience, and that has value in so much as it has helped us maintain a brand that can be trusted. And I do think the trust in our brand is a really important part of what we sell to consumers, especially when they have offerings from everywhere instantly. Differentiating yourself that way is really important. But let's be honest, I don't know that you would have me here if we didn't have a billionaire as an owner. That makes it a lot easier, there is no doubt. And a billionaire owner who, for the most part, leaves our journalism alone, but is constantly challenging us on our technology, is really just about the best possible offering we could have. Jeff Bezos, who bought the Post about 2 years ago, October 2013, obviously is the founder and owner of Amazon, made some very timely investments in Uber, has his own rocketry company, Blue Origin, is building an atomic clock. He's a very interesting and diverse guy. And all of that led me to ask, why the Post? Why does he want to buy the Post? And frankly, in all of our conversations, and we do talk somewhat frequently on a sort of bi-weekly basis, the Post talks to Jeff and explains what we're working on and asks for his feedback. I still can't tell you the single reason that he cares. I know that he values our commitment to free speech. I know that he is interested in the possibility of making a media company driven by technology that can actually be profitable. I wish I could say that we were, but we will be. I believe that. But what he has more than anything else done is invested very heavily, both in terms of time, technology, and then in financial support for the newsroom. And that has really made some dramatic changes. So, when he bought the Washington Post, we had about 30 million US uniques per month. We had about 4 to 5 million international unique visitors per month. We don't have our October numbers yet, at least not the comparable ones. We use ComScore. I don't know if that's what you guys rely on, but ComScore, we don't have the October ComScore numbers, but the September ComScore numbers say that we have about 60 million domestic visitors and about 20 million international ones. And so there has been this really incredible growth over the last 2 years that has led us to compare ourselves more to BuzzFeed and Vice than it has to the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and some of the traditional competitors. In part, that is driven by some changes. It's just driven by some of the changes that present themselves as challenges, actually were opportunities for us. Even before Bezos bought the Post, we were actually engaged pretty actively in trying to make a very mobile-friendly news website, and that's been incredibly important because we've had strong desktop growth, about 25% year over year, but we've had about 130% growth on mobile. And that's hugely important, and that's, I think, very tied not to our content per se, because although we've made some changes to our content that I'll talk about in a second, it's really more about our technology, which made it easier to consume that information. And that actually started before Jeff. The other thing I would say is we're changing a little bit how we publish our information. We did a disastrous experiment with video. We thought that we could out-news video the news video companies, all the traditional television publishers. And we invested very heavily, added, I think, 35 journalists to produce 4 21-minute video shows. We tried that for about 3 months and it failed completely. But it was a very valuable learning experience. And instead of producing these 21-minute videos, we've had incredible success producing very short-form content. We now produce, 40 to 60 videos a day, all of which are shorter than about 90 seconds. And we did more video starts last month than we did in any quarter last year. And so for us, it was a painful learning experience, but it was a valuable learning experience because we started to understand how our audience actually consumes video and how certainly they're consuming video on mobile, and by that I mean short, incredibly short form. But none of this would have been possible without that investment from Jeff. And that investment from Jeff was pretty significant. We've done a couple of things. We've hired about 75 brand new positions in our newsroom, taking us from roughly 600 journalists to about 700 journalists, a little shade under. We've hired for very different positions. We've chased a bunch of verticals. I assume, although I don't know, that when you think of the Washington Post, you think of the Washington part of the Post, meaning politics. And it certainly is true that our newsroom tries to cover the American political system, both the elections and the government, in ways that we hope that no one else can and does. We have about 60 journalists that are focused just on politics. And yet, most of the hires have not been in politics. We have very dramatically grown our audience for lifestyle content, really refocused on how we tell the story of the internet, and focused on how we share on social media, how we interact. We have a funny tradition at the Post. We have 2 managing editors and an executive editor that run our newsroom. And no one gets hired at the Post without interviewing with all 3 of them at once. It can be a pretty terrible experience if it goes bad. It can be really fun if it goes well. It just depends. If you get hired, it was probably pretty good. But I got a text message from my boss, who is one of those managing editors, during someone's job interview, which is never a good sign. If someone's texting during your job interview, really, it's not going to work. But what the text message said was, this reporter has 45 Twitter followers. How did they get here? And I think the truth of it was 2.5 years ago, at the Post, we would have considered it a luxury if our reporters were engaged on social media. If they were participating on Twitter, if they were thinking about Facebook, that was wonderful. But it really wasn't their job. The job of people in the newsroom was to do the reporting and writing, and the job of the audience, the social team, was to make sure that someone on social saw it. And that has completely changed. We still want to grow our core social accounts, but that is not our focus now. Our focus now is amplifying the individual reporters in the room using those core social accounts, which means that when we hire new journalists, we hire their audience. And so we don't hire journalists without an audience. We don't hire journalists without a following. And for the most part, we don't hire journalists without some subject area expertise. It's very interesting for us because from time to time, the President Obama's Twitter account will retweet things that are in the Post. And that's great. They have about 19 million followers with that account. It's a pretty sizable audience. And yet, when they retweet sometimes one of our business and technology reporters, who has about 40,000 Twitter followers, we will get more click-throughs from her original tweet than we will from the retweet from the president. And that has everything to do with what her audience is about. People follow her because they care about the technology and policy's impact on urban living, which is a very specific topic. And sometimes that aligns with the president, but it doesn't always align with the president's audience. And so for us, the critical way to think about our reporters is that they are not just creating content, but they're also responsible for distributing that content. And we've actually rethought their workload and their job a little bit based on the idea that it used to be enough to report your story, publish your story, and move on to reporting. But now every story is a 3-part process. Report your story, tell your story, probably in more than one way, and then continue to engage with your audience about that story. Because it's not enough just to promote on social media. You actually have to have a conversation on social media, and you have to make it worth the consuming by your audience. And that's a very different place than we ever imagined ourselves to be. It's particularly increasingly important because of this shift to mobile usage, that when we look at our mobile audience, almost all of it, about 3 to 5% of it, will come directly to WashingtonPost.com, and all the rest of it is coming what we call sideways, through search, through places like Google News and Flipboard, and dramatically through social. That the majority of our mobile audience comes from Facebook or Twitter or Snapchat, and even in that mix, it's really Facebook. So all of those things are particularly important, covering the new areas, covering them in new ways, and then we have committed to embracing technology and technologists in our newsroom in a way that we had never done before. When we hired a new CTO about 4 years ago, a little bit before Jeff Bezos bought the company. And at that time in our newsroom, we had 4 engineers, 4 developers who programmed. And at the time, we were really excited because this new CTO, who was very dynamic, he had promised more resources. And my boss went to him and he said, can we have 11? Can we have 11 developers in our newsroom sitting alongside our 600 journalists? And the CTO immediately said, no. Thought, okay, well, we still have the 4. It's something. And when he said no, that's not nearly enough. And almost immediately, he doubled it. So we had about 20 people in the newsroom. When Jeff Bezos bought the place, one of his first questions is, where are your technologists? Why are there so few who are actually embedded in the storytelling? Why are so many of them focused on supporting things like the computers, the phone system, the elevators, all of the sort of traditional IT functions? He said, the technology has to support your core business. The technology has to be for your customers. It can't be for your internal people. And so now we're moving to a new space in about 5 weeks, and we'll have just under 70 engineers, sitting with our reporters, working alongside our designers, working with our graphic artists. And that's a huge part of everything else that's happened, is our ability to build and make our own tools that do exactly what we want at the way we want them to. But the other thing we've had to challenge ourselves at the Post is to understand where we had conflated the idea of being a news producer and being a publisher. And to some degree, even today, I've used those terms a little bit more interchangeably than I should, which is to say that thinking of yourself as a publisher really locks you into one or maybe a couple of formats. And it's true, the one way we very directly control the entire path to our audience is print. And print is still a hugely important part of our business, important financially, important because of the relationship it has with our customers, and important because we touch the doorsteps of every one of those, give or take, I don't know, 600,000 or 700,000 people directly. And yet, you know, the web is not unlike that. When people deliberately come to us, come to WashingtonPost.com, they're still saying, we have a direct relationship with you. We're coming to seek out your content. But the more that we concentrate on those paths, on those ways of distributing news and information, the less able we are to attract the new audiences that we know that we need. And so in large part, what we've tried to do is change our thought about what our atomic unit is, what it means to distribute news. So first, we used to think about the website, and we used to think about the printed publication. And then over time, we got a little bit better about it, and we said, okay, a story. That is that atomic unit of storytelling. But we realized even that's not really true. And so what we've tried to do is we've tried to subdivide even the stories out and say, a video, that's an individual unit of storytelling. A graphic, that's an individual unit of storytelling. A tweet, the text, maybe even parts of the text, breaking up the articles. And then we've tried to say, how do we distribute those pieces? So instead of distributing an entire story, we push out any part of our story to the channel where it makes the most sense. So parts of the text belong on Facebook and Twitter. Parts of the video belong on Vimeo and YouTube and our own content channel and Snapchat. The graphics can be used in a whole bunch of different places, but we make them incredibly socially shareable because those images on Facebook or Twitter have everything to do with whether an article gets shared or not. And we think very much more in terms of how do these pieces work together than we think about how do we give you this whole experience. Because we can't afford to. Because Apple and Facebook and Google, who control so much of our audience now, aren't interested in our entire product. They're interested in these smaller pieces of our product, and that's the way that we drive audience. And it's led to some very interesting partnerships. So this is a question, but someone can confirm. Has Facebook Instant already come to Australia? Do you click on a story and it loads directly in Facebook for you? Yes? For some people. Okay. And it depends on how active a Facebook user you are, and initially only 5% of people got it, at least stateside, and so it may be rolling out over time. But what it basically means is in the past, if you were using the Facebook app and someone shared a link, it would take you to our mobile website in their very brutally bad mobile web browser, which didn't do many of the things that even the traditional smartphone browser, which isn't that great, did. Now, it won't even do that. It will load directly in the app. And so we came to Jeff Bezos and we said, Jeff, we just want to let you know we're going to do this experiment. We think we're going to do 25 or 30 stories a day, and we'll give them to Facebook, and we'll see what happens when people use them in the app. And he said no. This is a running theme, I guess, in this, is this no, but it's true. He said no. He said, that's not an experiment at all. You won't learn anything from that experiment. How will you know whether that worked or not? I mean, if you pick the most engaging stories, well, then obviously it's going to be better. If you pick the worst stories, then who's going to want to look at those anyway? And so what we're doing is we're taking about the 1,200 stories a day that we publish, and we're putting them all on Facebook Instant. And we'll do that until we know that that doesn't work. And it's interesting because from a revenue standpoint, we get a revenue share on the advertising in those that we split with Facebook, which is not ideal. And we're very much restricted in what we can do in terms of the kinds of ads. Ad tracking is almost non-existent. You can't do animation, a lot of the other things you're doing. But we are committing fully to exploring it because we won't know otherwise whether we should. Similarly, we're also talking with Google. And it was very interesting because Google came to us and Google AMP, which they rolled out a little less than a month ago, about 3 weeks ago. Google AMP is trying to speed up the web dramatically. This is usually important for us. One of the first things Bezos pushed us on was the speed of our mobile web pages. They were loading in about 6 to 7 seconds, and he said, absolutely not. Faster, 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 faster. Within the first year, we got to about 4.5 seconds. Now we're down to about 3.5 seconds. But frankly, getting any faster than that is going to require different advertising standards because our content is loading in about 1 to 1.3 seconds. And a character is a character. It's not going to get that much faster. But the need for it to be faster, the need for faster advertising standards. So we're simultaneously committing to Facebook, which is taking all of our stories and putting them inside their app. And we're completely committed to Google and trying to speed up our mobile site because we can't afford to not explore any of these channels. We're also, and this is as of about 3.5 days ago, instituting deep linking throughout our site. Because one of the things that we've seen, and we launched a new national suite of products, in large part through Jeff Bezos' support, is we're going to link from the web into those apps because we see so much deeper engagement within those apps. And that, too, is really important. When people are spending 3 or 4 times as much time and they're looking at 2 to 3 times as many articles when they're inside the app as when they're on the mobile web, there's no reason not to drive them into the app. And yet, it's a very different paradigm, and we're asking people to come to us via mobile web and then stay via the app experience. So on top of all of these things, we're also really changing the storytelling tools that we use. And again, this is only possible because of the engineers that are embedded in our newsroom. So we are building brand new video players that allow us to do video in different forms. So for example, we have a video player that is shape agnostic. You think about the letterbox, the 16:9:9 traditional video format. We're enabling square video, vertical video, video in all different kinds of shapes and sizes because we know that when you're using your mobile device, that device is really held vertically. The days of asking you to turn that and look at it sideways, it's not really going to happen. And so that's increasingly important. We have built a suite of content management system tools. A video content management system, a text content management system, analytics tools, tools for social sharing, tools that help remind reporters where they've shared a story and where they should, where we're missing. And all of these things are only possible because of how tightly interwoven that technology culture is in our newsroom. And then we're working on the next generation of tools. So we're thinking very much about video storytelling using drones. How can we bring a different perspective? How can we use 360-degree video cameras to tell stories that are incredibly immersive, that take you to places you could never go? We're telling stories in virtual reality, where we're creating very experiential 3D worlds that you can walk around inside, and we'll tell our stories in there. We're working on a virtual reality newscast, where on a daily or weekly basis, you'll be able to consume your news and information inside the Oculus Rift or the Sony Morpheus or the HTC Vive. And we're trying to do all of these things without losing touch with what was so important to us, which is this culture of really important, really valuable news reporting. And so hopefully what we'll end up being able to deliver is a profitable, but also still true to our brand, but cutting edge in terms of the use of our technology media company. And I think it is possible to do, although a lot of these things, as I said, are experiments, and it won't be for a number of years until we bear them out. So I'd love to take questions if you have some.
Fantastic, Jeremy. Thank you very much. Now, if you want to ask a question, we have roving microphones. Roving. There's David, there's one in the middle there. I've got 30,000 Twitter followers. Can you hire me?
You're in better shape than that.
Please. Yes, sir.
Yes, thanks, Jeremy. You've spoken a lot about how news reporting and even features are becoming much more bite-sized. Just interested in any observations you might have, having come across from National Geographic, where long-form storytelling is still king. I know that some changes are taking place there because of its recent purchase by Murdoch, but it will probably remain the way it has been. How did some of the lessons that you learned there translate into this, and is there a reverse flow possible?
You know, I think, and this is going to sound very ironic, that long-form storytelling is more valued than it was even a couple of years ago. I think the irony is, and this is where our newspaper culture, at least at the Post, has really hurt us, is that there is a huge, yawning, ever greater gap between very, very short form and long form. That people are every bit as willing to invest in great long form storytelling as they ever were. What they are really not interested in was what we used to churn out in high volume, which was on the section front, you know, the lead metro story that we measure, unfortunately, in inches, we'd call a 15, 18-inch story. I don't know, it'd be 12, 1,500 words. That length is just a killer. It just doesn't work right now. Maybe it will eventually, but it doesn't seem to work right now because it is not long enough for you to remember at the end of the day that you want to look at it, but it's not short enough for you to consume right now. And so the lesson at National Geographic, and it applies very much to the Washington Post, although we lack some of the amazing photography that National Geographic had and the explorers, is that you need to be able to carve off individual pieces of those stories to make them resonate. So they are the single, National Geographic is the single largest brand, media brand on Instagram. Because those individual images really resonate. But then what it does is it builds that brand and it connects people to the very long form storytelling, which is still incredibly powerful and incredibly successful. We do plenty of long form storytelling at the Post. What we're trying to get out of doing is that mid-length that no one seems willing to invest time in.
If you'd like to ask a question, raise your hand. I just want to ask you, I read a piece recently about some innovative methods you're looking at covering the 2016 election. Drones, 360-degree cameras. Can you elaborate on that?
Absolutely. No, that's the most fun part of my job and the work that my team does, which is to say that we are constantly trying to tell stories in new and never before seen ways. So a couple of weeks ago, at one of the Democratic presidential debates, we brought 360 cameras in and we showed people what existed behind the scenes. Because in large part, what we think we can do with some of these very innovative methods is offer a perspective that other people can't bring, and in particular to take you inside and show you what only the journalists get to see, the relationships they have with their sources, the places that are not available. And so that's what we're going to try to do. We're working with a number of American politicians to spend a day on the campaign trail with them, not just at the public events that everyone gets to see, but also at all the things in between that aren't necessarily available. And we think whether it's drones that supply a physical vantage point that's different or 360-degree cameras that allow you to really experience a story from your source's perspective, that's what's especially valuable.
So a day with Donald Trump, the audience will skyrocket.
Going on the plane. We want to go on the plane.
On the plane.
Really what we want to do.
Excellent. Yes, we've got a question down here. Dave, oh, sorry, you're at the back, then we'll come to you. Yeah. I don't think the mic's... You got to... Just
Sorry,
flick it
can
on.
you hear me
there
now?
You go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry. Can you expand a bit more on video when you said you went from 4 21-minute broadcasts to 60, 90-second grabs, 40 to 50 a day? What sort of content were you using? Were they linked with stories? Were they highlighting the best stories of the day, or were they...
No, it's a great question. So in terms of video, it's really a strategy that's multi-part. So instead of doing these traditional shows, one of the things that we've done is we have been much more aggressive about aggregating video. Not necessarily aggregating video from our competitors, but because everyone has a video recording device with them almost all of the time, we've very aggressively scoured social media for content that we can either repurpose just as it is, or that we can add our own analysis or spin to. And so we spend a lot of time looking for that kind of content. We have changed who's responsible for video in our newsroom, just as we have with social, which is to say that the video team isn't solely responsible for creating video and for starring in the video, but rather that our entire newsroom, all of our reporters who are experts in their subject areas, are creating video with the video team. So that's helped. And the shorter form video is very often based off of much more live news, where the shows were much more, here's what's happened. But because they're being shared on social, the being in the moment is so critical. So this shorter form video that can be done very quickly and published immediately, that's really helped to resonate. So that's in large part what we've done. We still do some what we call short form documentary, meaning maybe in the 5 to 10 minute length. But that's a lot like the long form content that we talked about. We have to count on the audience spending time probably at the end of their day with that content instead of having something that's rich and resonates on social right away.
Hello, I just had a question about online advertising. What do you think the future will be for advertising? Banner ads obviously have been around with us for a while, and will that continue, or do you see something else coming up? And another question on the tools that you developed. I understood that you have built your own tools, analytics tools, web content management, video. Why did you do that instead of using the platforms that are out there and available?
Great questions. One, I think the irony for all of us is, or for many of us, I don't mean to speak for everyone in this room, is that being in a general news publication makes it very tough to have really fabulous advertising. The challenge being that you don't really know what kind of an audience you're going to get. That when you think about the publications, what we call in the States the shelter titles that care about architecture or interior design, it's very easy to figure out what kind of advertising should go with that content. And in some cases, the advertising can be even more valuable than the editorial because it's something that you care about. If you care about fashion and you're going to read Vanity Fair or Vogue, when Vogue has the 700-page issue that's mostly advertising, it's really important. It's valuable to you. Our challenge is, how do we create a large enough audience that we can start to deliver smaller subsections of that audience where we can tell more to the advertiser about what the interests of those people are, and we can better connect the advertising. So I think one thing is we need to be able to do better segmentation. And we're working on a bunch of tools that will help with that, as are a lot of the advertising companies. The second thing is, frankly, the ads need to get faster. They have to get faster. If we don't make ads that are faster and less disruptive of the editorial experience, then the audience will gravitate either to other platforms or to ad blockers. And we've already started to see that. We did an experiment where we asked people using ad blockers to register with us, saying, in essence, we'll trade a little bit more information about you for your right not to look at our site with ads. But that's not a long-term solution. So the ads need to get faster. The ads need to get not more personal in a creepy way, but more personal in a useful way. And we probably need to find some more formats that are engaging. There's plenty of advertising that people are talking about and are engaging with and are interested in, but it's rare. It's not the norm. And so what we need to do is help our partners who want to sponsor things get to a place where people are as interested in their advertising as they are in our editorial. To some degree, that's native content. To some degree, that's new forms. I don't know if you saw over the weekend, the New York Times did a really interesting experiment in virtual reality. And one of the things they did is present this amazing GE, General Electric advertising experience in VR, and that's really incredible. So that's the advertising piece. Why build our own tools? It's for a couple of reasons. One, for the most part, we will never be the largest user of any tool produced by anyone else. So it's not that we never work with people who produce other tools, but we'll work with early stage startups where we're in a position to sort of help shape what that tool and technology becomes because we have that influence. But we also want a culture that rapidly produces new technologies because the marketplace is changing so quickly. And so we don't want to invest very heavily in a content management system that gives you these features and then discover that we need other features and then they're not interested in producing them. So by building our own tools and actually challenging ourselves to sell the tools that we produce, which we're starting to do, we are better positioned to rapidly evolve. And that's an important part. Are our tools always better than everything else that's out there? No. But when our tools are worse, it's a lot easier for us to nudge the person next to us and say, this is what we need, than it is to talk to another company and say, are you willing to build these features?
Yes, over here.
You've talked about with advertising, but what about with content? Like, how far are you going to go with dynamic content and serving up based on reader preferences, what they read, and then pushing out via your various channels to them? Like, how far because you can take that obviously really far, but how far, sort of, where are you at now and where do you plan to go with that?
It's really interesting. One of the first things that we did, the people, oddly enough, who were most excited about the Amazon purchase were the team that does artificial intelligence and natural language processing. Because Amazon does this better than almost anyone in the world. And I say that not just because Jeff Bezos owns the Post. It really is true. They are pretty amazingly insightful about what you buy and what else you might want that has nothing to do with that original purchase. So we certainly have been trying to build the secret sauce around content recommendation. And that's very important. It's not enough to say you looked at a story in politics, therefore you want another politics story. Sometimes that's true, but often it's not true. So we've tried to get much better at that. We're segmenting now. In the US, we talk about zip code +4, which gets you down to, depending on how dense your area is, say 4 square streets or 8 square streets. So pretty narrow that way. And so we've tried to use location that way. We've tried to use what we call reference path. Where did you come from? So if you're coming from Facebook, you might be much more interested in other content that resonates on Facebook than you are in something that is working on our site or working on Twitter. So we've thought a lot about reference path. But we're also thinking a lot about, again, remember I was talking about the story not being the atomic unit? We are trying to tag our content at the unit level, meaning sort of paragraphs or individual photos, and we're trying to give a very personalized view of every story, because that's becoming increasingly important. The individual stories are the homepage to our site. If you come to a story from Facebook, you never see our section front on politics. You never see the homepage that we invest so much time in. You only see the article. And so we need to make both the content of the article and then all of the other pieces of information around it that are about advertising or other stories really unique to you. We're not at the point yet where we're showing or hiding or using different paragraphs yet or even different images for most people, but that certainly is where I see us going.
What's this doing to the workload on individuals? It took me 40 years to burn out. I think I'd burn out in 4 years or 4 months under this new regime.
It's a great question. So one of my favorite people in the newsroom, and just to put this in perspective, I went to university with his son, is someone who's covered politics, the dean of our politics team, and really the dean of the Washington Press Corps in terms of politics coverage, is a guy named Dan Balls. And Dan has worked for, I don't know if it's 35 years yet, but it's pretty near to, for the Post and covering politics specifically. And Dan has our largest Snapchat following. It's pretty amazing. I mean, there are journalists in our newsroom who are 24 who can't figure out Snapchat, and Dan did. So there are a couple of things. One, we have had to acknowledge that the rapid rate of telling stories for a print edition, that's just not necessarily possible with all of the things that we have to do. So we don't expect you to file 2 to 3 stories a day, every day, for your job. Part of your job is interacting on social. Part of your job is gathering information and distributing it over these other channels. Part of your job is really having a conversation with your audience. So some of it is probably our individual reporters, they are not producing as many long articles as they did before. They're producing some more short stuff than they were before, and they're really focused on social. But you're right, overall, the hardest thing about it is that social media is not a just at work job. It cannot possibly be. And that's one of the things that we've struggled with as a newsroom is we have you for 40 hours a week. We're a guild news organization, so there are very clear rules about what our reporters can and cannot do in and out of the office. And yet, the boundaries are definitely blurred in so much as your Facebook presence is both yours and ours. And so one of the things that we've struggled with is as people engage more deeply on social media and they talk about the thing that they work on, where are the lines? It's a little less clear. I do sometimes miss, early in my career, that feeling you might have gotten it right, you might have gotten it wrong, but when you sent it to the press and it was published, it was done. You came back the next day and started over again. We don't have that anymore. There's never a moment where we're done with a story. The story eventually sort of peters out, but by then you're working on something else. So certainly there's a bit of a workload change. There's a different expectation from your editors about how many mid-length section front stories you need to write. And yet, we may well be asking more than we were before, and that's something that we're wrestling with a little bit.
In digital media, speed to market can be very important for a story, but traditional fact-checking and source-checking still takes time. Have you re-engineered your workflow in this area?
A little bit. Speed to market, it could not be more important. We have several editors who focus solely on the news alerts that we push to people using our apps, and we push out across our website. And we track news alerts from 29 different organizations, each one about 6 to 7 different ways, different mobile carriers, different email addresses, just to see whose is first. And we see a 25 to 35% increase in traffic when we're first. It's hugely important. At the same time, we don't want to be wrong. I mean, we didn't invest 138 years in our brand to routinely be first and wrong. It's of no value. It's really very dangerous. We're struggling with right now what that process should exactly look like. Right now, we are erring a little bit more on the side of being late than we are on being wrong. What we are trying to do to close that gap between being right and being first is technical. So right now, when we have a story that our editors know is right, and we can push that information out, and sometimes all we might have is what we push in that alert. It may be a single statement of fact that's so important it has to go out even if there's no story attached. What we're doing is trying to make it so that when we get to that point, we can have a single button that we can push it out immediately. But what we're not willing to do is compromise on having editorial approval. We're not willing to get to a place where someone can push the button and be first, but be wrong. How we're going to get faster than that once we solve the technology challenge, I don't really know that we will. That's our goal is not to be so fast that we make mistakes. We just can't.
Yeah, down the back. Got time for a couple more questions.
You spoke earlier about taking different parts of a story and pushing it out through different channels, so different elements going through Facebook and Twitter. With that strategy, I just wondered how you protect the overall integrity of the message and the story.
Let me ask you this before you surrender the mic. Do you really mean the integrity of the story, or do you mean its value on the platform it's on?
I mean the integrity in terms of the completeness of the message, actually painting a picture, all the facts, presenting a complete story for the audience, as opposed to dismantling it and putting it out through the different channels where arguably it's not complete.
That makes total sense. I think that you have to have a balancing act. We know that our audience is going to tell the story in hopefully not too disjointed a way, but certainly with smaller pieces of our story, because that is just how sharing works, that you really can't share an entire story. So to some degree, what we want to do is help stimulate the conversation with the best view of that part of the story that we possibly can. So that's one thing. The second thing is we have to come to terms that some of our stories probably just need to be told that way, that in some cases, if you're going to reach an Instagram audience, they're probably not going to come back to your mobile website. So all you have is a single image and the text that goes with it, and you have to find a way to tell the whole story. The funny thing about it is that we already were pretty good at this, because in our news meetings, when we decided which stories were important, which stories went on the front page, which stories went on the home page, we were already summing up our stories in a very pithy way, but we never shared that. So to some degree, that's what we're doing, is we're taking that consolidated view and hopefully training our audience to know that there is more. Is there a risk that as we divide up the story, it cannot be told in all ways? Yes, but that's something, especially as we increase our personalization, that we'll have to wrestle with. But we have to find ways to share little bits of it, or otherwise people won't look at the whole thing. There's no chance.
Hi, a couple of questions. One is, how have you dealt with the constant pull of print within the newsroom, and where a lot of old reporters still struggle to move away from that and the feedback they get through that, through their contacts? And my second question is the technology one, in regard to the huge amount of resources you're obviously putting into technology, and yet increasingly you're putting your stories on other people's technology, whether that be Facebook or Snapchat or etc.
Okay, so it's easy for it to sound like we've got the print problem figured out. And by print problem is really twofold. So one side is how important that print revenue is to our newsroom. It's hugely important. We could certainly not forgo that. But at the same time, we really can't afford to grow our digital audience, which is now more than 60 times as big as our print audience, well, not 60. On a daily basis, it's probably 6 times as big, and on a monthly basis, it's a little more than that. We've done a couple of things, one of which is there was a rumor going around that was never actually true, but there was a rumor going around that reporters at the end of the year, someone would count the number of times they appeared on the front page, and that was related to their compensation. So we certainly told them that was not true, any more than appearing on the front page of the website or the front page of the news apps, or even right now, there's no connection between traffic and someone's personal compensation. So we've tried to be very explicit about that. We've also reshaped how we handle our news meetings, which has gone a little bit of a way to help with that, which is to say, in the morning, we used to talk almost solely about what had been in the newspaper that morning, the sort of news from the day before. And we stopped that entirely. We really focus on how was the traffic the day before, the digital traffic, because that's the only thing that's measurable. And we talk about how we're going to day part the rest of the day. What do we publish at 8? What do we publish at 10? What do we publish at 4? And so on. So that's helped a little bit. It's not until 4 o'clock that we actually talk about what's on the front page for the next day. So many of the reporters know that they're under pressure to publish long before we could be talking about the print. The other thing that we are doing now is we are building analysis tools that really focus on the digital publication into the story creation tools. So that as you write your story, you see what other stories have resonated, and after you publish your story, you see what other stories of yours are resonating right now on social, on the site, on other people's sites. And so we're using that as a way to sort of drive the reporter's interest to that, because they don't get any measurable feedback from the newspaper other than maybe their neighbors talking about it. So that's what we've tried to do. I'm not sure we're completely there. I wish our news meetings were even less about the printed publication than they are. We don't spend a lot of time talking about what was on the front page of the app yesterday. I don't really want to spend time talking about what was on the front page of the newspaper yesterday or what will be tomorrow, but we're getting there. As far as the tools and technology, it's a very tricky thing as we cede a lot of control over where our content goes, but it's also increasingly an acknowledgement of where our audience is. We probably can't afford not to be focusing on what's happening on Facebook right now. Ironically, as the Facebook audience has gotten older and older, it's gotten even more valuable to us, because a lot of the same people who used to love us in print are now pretty religious Facebook users. The audience changes a little more slowly. Do you have Kik, the messaging service here? So it's a thing in the States. It was a failed company that they restarted. They pivoted it in Silicon Valley parlance, and they changed it a little bit, and somehow it really took off with high school students in the States, people between 16 and 18. So we did some experiments with Kik. We created a messaging bot where you could ask it a question and it would tell you about some news that was related to that question. And the average age of our Kik users, and we have a pretty healthy Kik audience now, is 14. I have no idea what we're going to do with a 14-year-old audience. We're not going to get them back to our site. They're certainly not going to subscribe. They don't probably, hopefully, have a credit card yet. But we want, again, for our brand to resonate with them. So as we invest in this technology, and I hope I'm answering your question on this front, we are very much moving towards trying to save our reporters time. It doesn't necessarily feel or sound like that, but we want to look at every point of friction where either our consumers, our news consumers, are being slowed on the path to learning something new, or our reporters are slowed on the path of creating something new, and we're trying to use our technology to eliminate that. And then we're trying as much as possible in working with these partners and building our own technology tools to distribute our content as widely as we can, in the hopes that we don't know which of these experiments will work, but that we will have done the right experiments so that when the new audience does emerge, we're there.
We're just about out of time. I'll finish up with the question I've been wanting to ask all lunch. Does Bob Woodward still make the odd appearance in the Post newsroom?
He does. Bob does come by, and in fact, but it is as hopefully exciting as it would be for you, it is for the people in our newsroom. In fact, Woodward and Bernstein were both in about 9 months ago, and that's very rare. They come individually, but not usually together. Just coincidence, busy schedule. But they left a note for one of their colleagues who's still at the Post, has been at the Post about 40 years. And people were gathering around. They were, taking Instagram photos of this note, and people were talking about whether they could steal a note that is signed by Woodward and Bernstein. And they didn't, which was good. But You know, the big challenge for us, I think, is as we move to a new building, which is about 6 streets away, we just hope that Bob will be able to find his way to the new building. I don't really know, but in a lot of ways, when I started at the Post, Ben Bradley passed away, and his funeral was at the National Cathedral, and both Woodward and Bernstein spoke, and Don Graham, who was the owner and the latest in that line of Grahams who were long owners of the Post. And I do think a little bit, one of the challenges with Jeff taking over is that we are losing some of that connection to that generation of amazing, amazing newsmakers. And yet, we've had, just in the last 2.5 years, we've won 5 Pulitzer Prizes on some really important work. And all I can hope is that we're growing the next generation of Woodward and Bernsteins, and that, you know, to whatever degree, we'll take advantage of Bob while he's around and willing to work with us, and hope that we make a connection with the next generation.
Well, Jeremy, thank you very much for those fascinating insights. They are challenges that you outlined that are being faced by a lot of our media organisations here in Australia, but clearly challenges writ large, given the place the Post sits in the holds in the international media firmament. Jeremy's heading off to Sydney. In fact, this afternoon I've told him after 24 hours here to expect to be disappointed by Sydney. So just a bit of reality check, as Melbourne is Australia's best city. And just tell anybody in Sydney that and you'll get a great response. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Jeremy Gilbert.